Not a joke. Oreos can lower LDL cholesterol. So let's see this video. Apparently he took Oreos to lower his cholesterol. I've never seen this video, so we're just gonna react to it and see what happens.
Sometimes, the best way to advance science is through a dramatic demonstration. 5 months ago, I started an experiment to see which would lower my cholesterol more. Standard of care, statin therapy, or Oreo cookies. Now, why would I do such an odd experiment? And which of these, in the end, did have the bigger impact on my cholesterol? Before getting into the story and the results, let me first emphasize that this experiment was a metabolic demonstration, a bold test of a new scientific model. This is certainly a do not do this at home sort of experiment, and I definitely do not recommend cookies for health.
Okay, obviously that's a good disclaimer there. We don't want to substitute Oreos as part of our normal diet every single day. Oreos are not a very healthy source of carbohydrates. They're obviously packed in sugar. Actually, I kind of want to see how much Oreos have, how much sugar Oreos actually have in them. Let's kind of look at their nutrition facts. So, okay, so 2 cookies is 140 calories, 21 grams of carbs, 13 grams of sugar, no protein, and 2 grams of saturated fat. So hopefully he says how many Oreo cookies he's eating a day, so we can kind of get a gist of how many calories, how many extra sugar, and how much saturated fat he's getting through this diet of kind of, how much he's getting through his Oreos.
Over the past several years, colleagues and I have been studying a phenomenon in which cholesterol, in particular LDL cholesterol, can rise dramatically in some individuals adopting a low-carb ketogenic diet. And when I say rise dramatically, when I say high, I mean into space high levels. Not 150 or 160, but as high as 300, 400, 500, 600 or more. And that's just the LDL. Interestingly, those who appear most susceptible to this phenotype, to this rise in LDL on low-carb diets, are otherwise very healthy and lean, with high HDL cholesterol, over 80 milligrams per deciliter, and low triglycerides below 70 milligrams per deciliter. This is the definition of the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, a metabolic triad of high LDL, high HDL, and low triglycerides on a low-carb diet.
All right, so I've seen this kind of thrown around a lot, this word lean mass hyperresponder. Basically people that have high LDL, low triglycerides, and high HDL as well. Obviously people think that HDL is very protective on the heart, and it is. However, the higher the HDL, there really isn't much more benefit. The point is not to have low HDL. You want your HDL, which is kind of the good cholesterol, to be higher than, whatever the cutoff is. Anything like drastically higher than that level, studies have not shown that there has a massive benefit for that. So there really is no point of having an HDL above 80 or 90 or 100. As long as you have an HDL above 40, then that's pretty much good enough for both men and women. Maybe it's a little bit higher for women, but for the most part, above 40 or 50 is good enough. You don't need to try to get that into the hundreds. Now, triglycerides, obviously the lower the better. Less than 70 is ideal. It's very, very good. But for the most part, anything below 100 is kind of good enough. Now, in terms of LDL, we don't want that anywhere near 200. So I understand what he's saying here, lean mass hyperresponders, people that have low triglycerides, high HDL, they also have high LDL, and they're basically trying to say that these people are not at risk of cardiovascular events. But I mean, studies have shown countless and countless times that high LDL is linked with high cholesterol. Now, is it the cause? We don't necessarily know, but it's very hard to determine what the cause of something is when you have to follow people for 20 years. That's when it becomes a little bit tricky because heart disease is not something that happens overnight. This takes years and years of plaque buildup to kind of have that heart attack or stroke and increase your risk. So we do know that high LDL is associated with cardiovascular disease. I'm kind of interested to see what his take is and what he has to say. Obviously, he's substituting Oreos in his diet. Hopefully, he also tells us what he substituted the Oreos with so we kind of know the diets are very, very similar in both of his groups. Because obviously, he's only one person, so the diets have to be pretty much identical in both groups, plus or minus the Oreos, to see what actually happened. So let's take a look.
And in our prior publications, we've actually documented an inverse relationship between BMI and cholesterol on low-carb diets. In other words, the leaner you are, the higher your cholesterol tends to rise when you're low-carb. So, why does this occur? The model we've been developing over several years is called the lipid energy model, and it states that the main driver is a drop in the body's carbohydrate stores, in particular the liver stores, which shifts energy demand from carb burning to fat burning. Now, for a dash more detail, getting into the weeds a bit, In these lean, metabolically healthy people, these lean mass hyperresponders, carbohydrate restriction increases trafficking of fat fuel to meet systemic or whole body energy demands. This trafficking system depends on the export of VLDL particles, which are precursor to LDL particles, and this turnover process also increases HDL cholesterol and lowers triglycerides, resulting in the lean mass hyperresponder triad of high LDL, high HDL, and low triglycerides. Now, based on the lipid energy model, adding back carbs, repleting the store of carbohydrates, glycogen, in the liver, should bring LDL back down. And based on the model, any carb should work. A banana, a potato, or a sleeve of Oreo cookies.
Okay, so he's basically saying that if you eat more carbs, you're going to reduce your LDL because, I mean, it's kind of obvious here. You're reducing saturated fat because a lot of usually carb-heavy foods are high in carbohydrates. They don't have much saturated fat. And in the case of the Oreos, we just saw that it's basically 1 gram of saturated fat per cookie.
I chose Oreo cookies, honestly, because it is provocative. To me, a nerd and a PhD scientist, the intricacies of the lipid energy model and the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype are themselves awe-inspiring. They make my jaw drop and think, wow.
Well, that's definitely for sure. I mean, Oreo cookies are a very unique way of kind of getting your point across here. So
now, I want to share this nerd enthusiasm with as many people as possible and bait you into following our research journey. But to do this, I knew I needed something that would turn heads. Oreo cookies seem to do the trick. Most people know what they are, and most people don't think of them as a health food. I know I certainly don't. So, after obtaining appropriate ethics and the support of my primary care physician and a consultant cardiologist, I began the first phase, adding 12 Oreo cookies per day, about 100 grams of extra carbs, to my otherwise standard low-carb ketogenic diet.
12 Oreo cookies per day. So let's bring this back up here. 2 cookies is 140 calories, so we're going to multiply that by 6 for 12. So that comes out to 840 calories and then 78 grams of added sugar. That is a significant amount of sugar to be eating every single day. So hopefully he measured his A1C and his blood glucose in this trial, because that's also something that he should be taking into consideration. Even though his LDL came down, his blood sugar for sure is going to go up. But something else to keep in mind is that saturated fat is only at 12 grams per day. That's a very small amount of saturated fat. So if he's substituting in his, during his statin phase, if he's substituting the Oreos with a fatty steak that has 30, 40 grams of saturated fat, then 100% the Oreos are going to lower your LDL and your total cholesterol, because that is the main driver of cholesterol levels. So you replace basically saturated fat with sugar, you're going to reduce your LDL. Overall, you're not going to be healthier as a person because your blood sugar is going to go through the roof with all this added sugar. But the 12 grams of saturated fat is going to be replaced with probably 60, 70 grams of saturated fat from a fatty fit, like a Wagyu steak or something. So, I mean, hopefully it says what he's eating in his other phase, during his statin phase, so we can kind of get an idea of, what the two foods are and if this actually has any merit. Because if you're just substituting Oreos, taking out a steak and putting in Oreos, yeah, your LDL is going to go down. We all know that.
This first phase lasted 16 days. And then I had a washout period, during which I returned to a similar body composition and cholesterol levels before starting a second phase, 6 weeks of high-intensity statin therapy with 20 milligrams of rosuvastatin.
All right, so 20 milligrams of Crestor is a pretty high dose. That's the second highest dose of rosuvastatin that you can get. It comes in 40, 20, 10, and 5. So him taking the 20 is definitely a high dose. It's considered a high-intensity statin to kind of lower LDL levels as drastically as possible. So let's see the results.
The results were stunning. In 16 days, 12 Oreo cookies per day lowered my LDL cholesterol from 384 milligrams per deciliter to 111 milligrams per deciliter, a drop of 273 milligrams per deciliter, or 71%.
Okay, to be honest, I was kind of skeptical on what the results would have been, but that is an insane drop. 384, which is absolutely way too high. That's an LDL that's not even total cholesterol. That's just LDL. That's way too high to have comfortably and not be afraid of a cardiovascular disease or event in the next 15, 20, 25 years. So hopefully he's not living his life like that all the time. Hopefully he just did that for the experiment and he kind of got his LDL, trying to get it as high as possible. Probably getting rid of a steak and adding an Oreo cookie or 12 Oreo cookies down to 111 is pretty unreal. And I'm kind of surprised that it came down that much. I was expecting it to go down from, let's say, like 384 down to like, I don't know, 270 or 250, something like that.
In fact, the reason the Oreo phase was prolonged from just 2 weeks or 14 days to 16 days is because the drop at the second interventional blood draw, which was on day 14, was so shockingly large to my supervising physician and I that we decided we needed to repeat it, at least in triplicate, with follow-up tests on days 15 and 16, and the results showed a continued downward trend at day 16, with Oreo cookies dropping my LDL closer and closer to 100 milligrams per deciliter.
I mean, yeah, I would be shocked too. I'm pretty happy that they retested it, because that kind of a drop, I would assume is a lab error. That's insane. And then the fact that he replicated it 2 different days and got the same result, actually lower than the previous days, shows that it's not a fluke and that this actually happened from the Oreos. So that's kind of impressive. That's kind of pretty interesting. There's obviously some science behind this, and we need to kind of look into this.
Now, these results on their own were well worth publishing, but we still had the statin arm to come. So following a washout period, I began the statin phase with my starting LDL at 421 milligrams per deciliter and similar body composition.
Okay, so right off the bat, we can see, first of all, the LDL is higher than what it was before by a lot, by around 40 points. So from 384, it went up to 421 when he's doing the statin trial. So that right there should tell you that his diet is not the same. Also, your diet must have been very unhealthy to begin with, or, it's very saturated fat heavy, because you went from 384 LDL down to 111 and then back up even higher to 421. So clearly your LDL is not controlled. You're eating a lot of saturated fat. My guess is that his LDL is going to go down to about 200, because Crestor 20 milligram gives it about a 50% reduction in LDL. So I'm looking at about a 200. That should be kind of good enough for what I would say his statin is going to do. Now, having an LDL of 421 is going to require not only the statin, it's going to require a second medication, ezetimibe or even Repatha, because you want that LDL even lower than 200. So the statin by itself should only get it to about 200. So looks like the Oreo is going to win in this case. Let's see what his result is, first of all, before I start going off again.
After 3 weeks on 20 milligrams of rosuvastatin, my LDL cholesterol started to plateau in the 280s and 290s, with a low of 284 milligrams per deciliter during the 6-week phase. Notice how this compares to the Oreo arm. 12 Oreos per day lowered my LDL by 273 milligrams per deciliter, or 71%, while high-intensity statin therapy only lowered my LDL by 137 milligrams per deciliter, or 32.5%.
Okay, so something here is not really adding up, because Crestor, like I said, shows a 50%, even higher in some patients, reduction in LDL. So him only reducing it by 30% is very, very minimal in regards to the potency and how much that Crestor can do. So I'm kind of shocked that that's all it came down to, 284. I would assume that it could get down to 200. 284 is higher than I would expect, but either way, the point of this is that the Oreo got it down much lower, twice as much basically, which is unreal, and in half the time. So basically 4 times more potent than a statin. So that itself is kind of insane to begin with. There has to be some kind of explanation here as to what it is. Obviously, he said in the beginning of the video, and he wouldn't recommend replacing Oreos in your diet as a means to reducing LDL. That's obviously not the right decision. But I think the point here is that he just eats a significant amount of saturated fat. I hope he says how much saturated fat he eats in a day so we can kind of see, because that's the main driver of the high cholesterol. There's really nothing else. We know that high cholesterol is associated with high cholesterol. Now, if that's associated with an actual heart attack or stroke, people want to argue that. But there's no arguing that a high saturated fat will increase your total cholesterol. Everybody knows that. Everyone that's on keto acknowledges that their LDL goes through the roof. They just choose to ignore it because they say that it doesn't matter if I'm not obese, overweight, no blood pressure, no blood sugar, things like that. I don't agree with that either. I think you should get your LDL controlled as well. But that's the logic behind that. We all agree that saturated fat does increase total cholesterol. In this case, you replace saturated fat with sugar. So it's obvious that your LDL will lower. It is surprising that it lowered by this much. Let's see what else he has to say before I kind of go on.
In other words, Oreo cookies were 2 times as potent as the statin for lowering my LDL cholesterol.
Technically 4 times more potent, because you did it in half the time, which is, again, insane.
To summarize, The Oreo arm resulted in a lowering of my LDL from 384 to 111 milligrams per deciliter in 16 days, for a drop of 273 milligrams per deciliter, or 71%. The statin arm, by contrast, lowered my LDL from 421 to 284 milligrams per deciliter over a course of 6 weeks, with a drop of 173 milligrams per deciliter, or 32.5%, at its nadir. So, Oreo cookies, in this context, in me, were 2 times as potent for cholesterol lowering as high-intensity statin therapy. I hope you agree. The results of this experiment are mind-boggling.
100% agree. That is insane.
True, it's an N=1 experiment, but the results were predicted by the lipid energy model, which were the impetus for this experiment. The results are consistent with other data on this population known as lean mass hyperresponders. And all this aside, even if this were an outlier response, shouldn't we be curious as to why? In the coming years, we are pursuing many larger scale, rigorous projects with scientific luminaries from around the world who are becoming interested in the lipid energy model and lean mass hyperresponders. So for now, you can consider this Oreo versus statin experiment and published paper a hook, an invitation for you to join us on what I know will be a fascinating scientific journey that I am so excited for. So join us.
Thanks for watching, everyone.
Dave Feldman, the guy who coined the phrase lean mass hyperresponder. Okay, I want to make sure that he doesn't say how much saturated fat he actually ate per day and what he replaced the Oreos with. And he doesn't. He just says that he's on a ketogenic diet. So it's kind of safe to assume that it's going to be a high saturated fat replacement of the Oreos. So again, I'm not discrediting the results of this study here. I'm not saying that these are not interesting and actually surprising results, but you probably just replaced saturated fat with sugar, reduced your LDL, increased your blood sugar, which you didn't measure, and then you're shocked that your LDL didn't go as low with the statin. Statins can only do so much. Again, I'm shocked that the statin only reduced it by around 30%, but that might be because he's eating a huge amount of saturated fats every single day on the ketogenic diet. It'll be interesting for him to measure all his other biomarkers, because in health, we care about totality. We don't only care about LDL. I feel like these kind of people, they're very fixated on LDL and heart disease. They're not looking at, blood sugar, blood pressure, weight. They're not looking at any of that stuff. They're just saying, all right, ignore LDL. Who cares about LDL? That's the only thing I don't care about. But you have to look at it as a whole. You can't fixate on only one biomarker, and you can't ignore any biomarker. You have to take it all in totality. That is something that is very, very important, and something that we should all kind of acknowledge when it comes to health, that, we're all on the same team here. Everybody wants to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. Everybody wants to be healthier. So there's no reason to fight each other. Now, again, in this case, we don't know what he replaced the Oreos with. I'm assuming it's going to be a fatty steak, because he probably wants to show his results to be as, great of a differential versus statins as possible. And the best way to do that is to go on a dirty keto diet and kind of, during your statin phase, eat the dirtiest foods. During the Oreo phase, eat cleaner foods, and also replace it with an Oreo and 12 Oreos a day, and there you go, your LDL will drop significantly. So we don't know what the rest of his diet looked like. So I'm not saying that he did that. I'm just saying it's very easily could have manipulated the results of the study in that way. That's my take on this video. It's going to be interesting to see where this LDL, cholesterol, keto diet kind of fight goes. But for now, this is obviously an N=1 experiment, and at the same time, didn't give any data on his other parts of his diet. So we have no idea, what else he ate and why those things happen. So not taking too much stock into this. Again, make sure your blood sugar, blood pressure, BMI, weight in general, and your stress levels and your cholesterol are all under control, under the guideline recommendations. Be as healthy as you can be, exercise as well. See you guys next time.